My husband put the prenup between us 12 days before our wedding and said, "I'm not risking my future on you." He didn't raise his voice. Ethan Weller never raised his voice when he believed he had all the leverage. We were sitting in a private dining room at the Hartwell Hotel in Charlotte, the kind of place where the water glasses were replaced before you noticed they were empty, and the servers somehow knew when not to enter. Outside the windows, rain had turned the city lights into long streaks of gold against the glass. Ethan wore the charcoal suit he used for investor meetings, no tie, white shirt open at the collar, his silver watch catching the candlelight every time he moved his hand. Between us sat a navy folder with his attorney's name embossed across the bottom. He pushed it toward me with 2 fingers. "I should have handled this months ago," he said. "The wedding changes things. Astor House is entering a major growth phase, and I have employees, investors, properties. I can't expose everything I've built because we're emotional about each other." Emotional about each other? I remember that phrase because sometimes a sentence doesn't hurt when you first hear it. Sometimes your mind puts it aside like a glass with a crack in it, and only later do you realize how carefully someone reduced your entire relationship to something inconvenient. I was 48 years old. I had already learned that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are being reasonable. Anger can lie, romance can perform, but entitlement usually speaks in a calm voice and calls itself common sense. I opened the folder. 26 pages, tabs, exhibits, separate property, business interests, future appreciation, investment income, real estate acquired through individually held entities, waiver of spousal claims. Ethan had prepared for every version of me except the real one. On page 4, his financial disclosure summarized his estimated holdings at just over $21 million. Astor House Hospitality Equity, 2 homes, investment accounts, deferred compensation. He had done well, very well, and he knew it. My section was several pages later. Townhouse in Myers Park, retirement accounts, consulting income, certain private investments to be detailed by separate disclosure. Ethan had apparently stopped paying attention somewhere around consulting income. He leaned back while I read, watching me with that controlled expression CEOs learn after enough years in rooms where everyone else wants something from them. I reached the signature page, then looked up. "Good," I said. "Sign it." His eyebrows moved just slightly. That was all, but I knew him well enough to catch it. "You're not going to have Rachel review it?" he asked. "She already will." "Nora, I'm serious." "So am I." I slid the folder back toward him. "If these are the terms you want, sign them." He stared at me for a second longer than necessary. He had expected resistance, maybe tears, maybe the wounded question women in bad movies are always supposed to ask. "Don't you trust me?" What Ethan didn't understand was that I was no longer interested in whether he trusted me. 6 weeks earlier, I had discovered something that made his trust almost irrelevant. If stories about people who stay quiet long enough to see the whole board are your kind of thing, subscribe, because that smile across the table was not surrender. Ethan picked up his pen. "I just want things clear from the beginning," he said. I nearly smiled again at that. Clarity is a strange gift. Most people imagine clarity arriving gently, like sunlight through curtains. Mine had arrived at 11:43 on a Tuesday night through a file Ethan never meant me to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ethan signed the prenup that evening with the same confidence he signed hotel acquisitions. Initial here, signature there. Quick glance at the exhibits. His attorney, Martin Hale, had spent weeks protecting Ethan from the possibility that his future wife might someday reach for what belonged to him. What neither man seemed curious about was what might already belong to me. That wasn't because I had hidden anything illegally. Rachel Donnelly, my attorney and one of my closest friends for almost 20 years, had made sure every required disclosure was complete. There were trusts, investment entities, partnership interests, a family office called Cedar Vale Partners. Everything was there for Ethan's counsel to examine. The truth was less dramatic and somehow more revealing. Ethan simply wasn't interested enough to look closely. He had decided what kind of woman I was before he asked me to marry him. Once people decide you are smaller than they are, they stop measuring. 6 years before that rainy night, I had sold the controlling interest in a building energy software company I founded in my 30s. The transaction closed at $52.8 million before taxes, fees, employee payouts, and everything else that makes a large number become a less glamorous but still very large number. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't move to Miami. I didn't put founder, investor, visionary under my name online. I bought my mother a house outside Raleigh, kept my townhouse, created Cedarvale, and went back to wearing the same boots I had owned for 4 years. Money had already taught me something Ethan apparently still needed to learn. The more loudly you announce what you have, the more people begin negotiating with the number instead of the person. I wanted to know who liked Nora Beckett when Nora Beckett was just a woman who did some consulting. Ethan seemed to, at least in the beginning. We met 2 years earlier at a preservation fundraiser in Asheville. I had escaped onto a balcony because inside, 50 wealthy people were pretending not to notice which other wealthy people were in the room. Ethan walked out holding 2 drinks and offered me one without asking what I wanted. "Club soda," he said. "You look like someone who hates these events as much as I do." I laughed, not because the line was particularly good, but because he looked genuinely miserable. That first night we talked for nearly 3 hours. He told me Astor House had 7 boutique hotels and plans for 12. I told him I advised companies occasionally and managed a few investments. He never asked how large the investments were. Back then, I mistook that for good manners. Later, I realized it might have been something simpler. He had already looked at my townhouse, my car, my clothes, my quiet life, and reached a conclusion. People rarely investigate assumptions that flatter them. We dated for 18 months. Ethan could be thoughtful in ways that made you lower your guard. Once, when I had the flu, he drove from Atlanta to Charlotte after a board dinner just to leave soup outside my door because I told him I didn't want company. He remembered my mother's birthday. He knew I hated lilies and loved gardenias. When he proposed, it was on a Sunday morning in Charleston, with no photographer hiding nearby and no crowd waiting to applaud. I believed that mattered. Maybe it did then. Human beings are complicated enough that I've stopped believing every lie means everything before it was a lie too. Sometimes love is real when it happens and still not strong enough to survive the person someone decides to become. Our wedding was scheduled for October. By August, Ethan's company was preparing for the largest financing deal in its history. Suddenly, there were investor dinners every week, weekend calls, flights to Atlanta, lawyers at the house, and one name I began hearing more often than the rest, Vanessa Cole, Chief Strategy Officer. Brilliant, according to Ethan. Relentless. Essential to the deal. I met Vanessa 3 times before the wedding. She was polished, warm, and almost unnervingly observant. The second time we met, she knew what wine I preferred, even though I had never told her. I noticed. Then, I told myself not to become suspicious of a woman just because she was competent. That's another thing age teaches you. Intuition and insecurity can sound almost identical in your own head. And if you've been hurt before, you learn not to convict people simply because something feels wrong. So I watched. I listened. I let Ethan talk. And then, 6 weeks before he placed that prenup in front of me, I went looking for the insurance certificate for our Charleston venue on the shared drive we used for wedding documents. I clicked the wrong folder. At least, that's what I told myself at first. The folder was labeled Beacon, Personal. Inside it was a presentation called CEO Stability Strategy, Phase 2. I opened it because my name appeared in the preview pane. The first few slides were about Astor House's upcoming $310 million recapitalization. Investor confidence, executive continuity, governance risk. Then I reached a page with my photograph on it. Nora Beckett, age 48, low public profile, non-industry spouse, minimal reputational exposure. I sat very still. There are moments when your body understands betrayal before your mind has found the language for it. My hands went cold. My breathing slowed. I kept reading. Wedding timing aligned with investor roadshow. Improved perception of CEO personal stability. Reduced lifestyle risk concerns. I wasn't described like a fiancé. I was described like a favorable line item. Then I reached phase 3. Post-transaction personal restructuring, 30 to 36 months after closing, and buried in an attached email chain was Vanessa Cole's name. One message from Ethan contained a sentence I read 4 times before I finally accepted that the words were not going to rearrange themselves into something kinder. Once the deal closes, we won't need to keep pretending forever. Vanessa had answered 9 minutes later. 3 years isn't forever. I closed the laptop that night and sat alone in the dark for nearly an hour. 12 days before our wedding, Ethan thought the prenup was the first time he had shown me how carefully he was protecting his future. He had no idea I had already seen the future he was planning without me. And when he slid that pen across the table and asked me to protect him from the woman he thought I was, I understood something almost comforting in its simplicity. He had made one mistake from the beginning. He had mistaken my quiet life for a small one. So I picked up the pen, signed my name beneath his, closed the folder, and smiled. Because the prenup wasn't the moment I realized Ethan didn't trust me. I had learned something much worse 6 weeks earlier. If you had asked me during the first year I knew Ethan whether he was capable of turning a marriage into part of an investor presentation, I would have defended him before you finished the question. That is the embarrassing thing about betrayal when you look backward at it. Once you know the ending, every old memory seems to volunteer as evidence. But when you were actually living those moments, they didn't feel like warnings. They felt like Tuesdays. They felt like dinner. They felt like someone reaching across a table to take your hand. Ethan and I met on a cool October evening in Asheville, North Carolina, at a fundraiser for the restoration of an old theater downtown. I almost didn't go. A friend of mine, Melissa Grant, had bought 2 tickets and called me that afternoon because her husband had come down with a stomach bug. "You spend too many nights reading quarterly reports," she told me. "Put on something that doesn't have pockets and come talk to people." "Everything I own has pockets." "That," she said, "is exactly why I'm calling." So I went. Black dress, low heels, pearl earrings my mother gave me when I turned 40. Nothing dramatic. The ballroom was beautiful in the exhausting way expensive rooms often are. Chandeliers, polished wood, flowers large enough to require their own zip code. Everyone seemed to know everyone else. I knew enough people to be polite and not enough to enjoy myself. After 40 minutes, I escaped onto a stone balcony overlooking the city. I was leaning against the railing when the door opened behind me. "Please tell me you're hiding too," a man said. I turned and saw Ethan carrying 2 glasses. He was 50 then, tall, silver beginning at his temples, expensive jacket, easy smile. Not movie star handsome. Better than that. He looked competent. At 46, I had reached the age where competence was more attractive to me than charm, because I had already learned how expensive charm could become. "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm strategically unavailable." He held out one of the glasses. "Club soda?" I looked at it. "How did you know?" "You've been carrying the same champagne flute around for 20 minutes without drinking from it." That made me laugh. He noticed things. At least, I thought he did. We talked for almost 3 hours. He told me about Astor House Hospitality, which, at the time, owned 7 boutique hotels across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee. He talked about buildings the way some men talk about sports cars. Not the marble or furniture, but how people moved through them, where the morning light landed, why a lobby should make someone feel like they had arrived somewhere instead of merely checked in. I liked listening to him. Passion is attractive when it hasn't yet turned into ego. When he asked what I did, I gave him the answer I had been using for years. I consult a little, mostly manage investments now. What kind of consulting? Energy efficiency, commercial buildings, operations, boring things that save people money. He smiled. Nothing that saves people money is boring. That was all he asked. He didn't ask how many investments I managed. He didn't ask what I had done before consulting. He didn't search my name in front of me like I'd seen men do on first dates. At the time, I thought it was refreshing. I had spent the years after selling my company learning how quickly money changed the temperature in a room. People became more attentive, more agreeable, sometimes almost aggressively interested in your childhood. Men who had found me ordinary at dinner suddenly remembered how fascinating I was after learning a number. There are things wealth buys that no financial advisor puts in a brochure. One of them is suspicion. Eventually, you start wondering whether affection arrived before or after the information. So I stopped volunteering the information. Not as a test. Tests are manipulative. I simply wanted people to meet me before they met my balance sheet. Ethan did, or I believed he did. Our first real date was 6 days later at a small restaurant in Hendersonville. No private dining room, no sommelier. He ordered trout, I ordered chicken, and he spent 10 minutes telling me about a hotel manager in Savannah who had once saved a wedding by finding a replacement cake at 2 in the morning. He loved people who solved problems. That was one of the first things I loved about him. Over the next year, he made room for me in a life that seemed to have very little room left. He called from airports. He drove to Charlotte after long meetings. He learned that I read before bed and started sending me photographs of bookstores whenever he traveled. When my mother had minor surgery, he showed up at the hospital with coffee for both of us and sat beside me for 5 hours without once checking his phone in a way that made me feel like I was competing with it. Those memories are still real to me. I refuse to hand them all over just because of what happened later. People like simple stories where one person was always good and the other was always pretending. But life is rarely that generous. Sometimes a person can love you and use you. Sometimes they can be kind on Monday and calculating on Friday. The contradiction doesn't make either part imaginary. It just makes accepting the truth harder. Ethan proposed 18 months after we met. We were in Charleston for a weekend, walking near the Battery early on a Sunday before most tourists were awake. No photographer, no violinist, no friends jumping from behind a tree. He stopped near the water, reached into his coat pocket and said, "I'm 51 years old, Nora. I don't want to spend the next 20 years pretending I'm still deciding what I want." I cried before he even showed me the ring. I said yes. For the next few months, I was embarrassingly happy. We chose a small, historic property outside Charleston for the wedding. 84 guests. Garden ceremony, dinner under a covered courtyard. Ethan complained about the flowers costing more than some of his hotel rooms, then secretly upgraded the band because he knew my mother liked Motown. That was Ethan then. Or maybe that was one piece of him. The change came slowly enough that I could explain each part away. Astor House was preparing for an enormous recapitalization, the largest deal of Ethan's career. Investors wanted expansion. The board wanted stronger margins. Lawyers wanted documents yesterday. Suddenly, Ethan was in Atlanta twice a week. Calls began during dinner. Sundays became workdays. He still kissed my forehead when he left in the morning, but sometimes I had the strange feeling he was doing it because it belonged on a checklist. Vanessa Cole's name appeared constantly. Vanessa thinks Nashville is overbuilt. Vanessa found another lender. Vanessa wants to restructure the roadshow. Vanessa was 41, Astor House's chief strategy officer, and by every objective measure, excellent at her job. The first time we met was at a company dinner in Charlotte. She shook my hand, looked directly into my eyes, and said, "I've heard so much about you." It was a perfectly normal sentence. Still, something about it stayed with me. Not fear, not jealousy, just the faint sense that she knew which page of a book I was on while I didn't even know we were reading the same book. The second time we met, she ordered me a glass of Willamette Valley Pinot before I sat down. "Ethan said it's your favorite," she explained. Maybe he had. I told myself that was sweet. A younger version of me might have started checking phones and measuring pauses. At 48, I knew that suspicion can poison a relationship just as efficiently as betrayal can. So I watched without accusing. Ethan came home late. I noticed. Vanessa called on weekends. I noticed. Investor dinners multiplied. I noticed. But noticing is not knowing, and there is dignity in refusing to turn anxiety into evidence. Then one Tuesday night, 6 weeks before our wedding, Ethan was in Atlanta, and I was home in Charlotte trying to finish the least romantic task associated with marriage, locating the insurance certificate our wedding venue had requested for the third time. We kept wedding documents on a shared cloud drive, contracts, vendor invoices, travel schedules, seating charts. I opened a folder I thought contained venue paperwork and found another directory nested beneath it, Beacon Personal. I almost closed it. Almost. Then a preview panel opened on the right side of the screen, and I saw my own face. Not a wedding photograph, a professional photograph pulled from an old company profile I hadn't seen in years. Beneath it was my name, Nora Beckett, age 48. I clicked the file. The title page read, CEO Stability Strategy, Phase 2. The first slides were corporate language I understood immediately. $310 million, recapitalization, investor roadshow, governance exposure, executive continuity. Then I reached slide 19. My photograph appeared again. Beside it were 6 bullet points: low public profile, non-industry spouse, limited media footprint, no known controversial affiliations, minimal reputational exposure, positive stability signal. I read the last line twice. Positive stability signal. My engagement ring suddenly felt heavier on my hand. I kept scrolling because sometimes when your instincts finally stop whispering and start speaking clearly, you become strangely calm. The next slide contained a timeline. Wedding, investor roadshow, transaction close, phase 3, post-transaction personal restructuring, 30 to 36 months. There are documents you read with your eyes, and there are documents you feel moving through your body. I could hear my refrigerator humming behind me, rain tapping against the windows, a car passing on the wet street outside. Ordinary sounds. That is one of the cruelest things about life-changing moments. The world almost never provides appropriate music. Then I opened an attached email thread. Vanessa Cole was copied. Ethan had written 5 words that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "We won't need this forever." Vanessa's reply came 9 minutes later. 3 years isn't forever. I stared at those words until the screen dimmed, and for the first time since Ethan Weller walked onto that balcony in Asheville carrying 2 glasses, I wondered whether he had found me by accident at all. I didn't close the file after Vanessa's message. I wanted to. Every decent instinct in me said I had already seen enough, that whatever came next would only make something painful more specific. But there are moments when not knowing becomes more frightening than the truth. So I stayed at the kitchen island with the rain sliding down the windows behind me and kept reading. The presentation was 48 slides long, and the deeper I went, the less it looked like a business document, and the more it looked like someone had taken my future, removed every human part of it, and converted it into bullet points. There was a section called Executive Narrative Positioning. Under Ethan's name were phrases like disciplined growth, mature leadership, long-term stability. Under mine, low-profile spouse, independent professional identity, limited media exposure, no operational involvement. I remember staring at that last phrase, no operational involvement, unreliable, as if the greatest thing I could offer the man I planned to marry was that I would stay out of the way. The strange part was that none of those statements were technically insulting. That is how sophisticated cruelty usually works. It doesn't call you worthless. It describes the ways your existence is useful to someone else and waits for you to realize what has been left out. There was nothing about the fact that I knew how Ethan took his coffee when he had slept less than 4 hours. Nothing about the night I sat beside him in an emergency room in Savannah after he thought he was having a heart attack and it turned out to be exhaustion. Nothing about my mother saving him a seat at Thanksgiving because she had started thinking of him as family. Nothing about the Sunday in Charleston when he asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. I had been reduced to what investors would see when they looked at the CEO's wedding photographs. Safe, quiet, stable, harmless. I scrolled further. The timeline was detailed enough to make my stomach tighten. October, wedding. November through January, lender meetings and investor roadshow. First quarter, recapitalization announcement. Second quarter, executive media campaign. Year 1, hospitality expansion into 3 new markets. Year 2, liquidity event for selected early shareholders. Then, near the bottom, separated by a thin gray line, phase 3, personal restructuring. There were no romantic words, no divorce, no separation, just a date window beginning 30 months after the expected close of the transaction. I clicked the supporting notes. One sentence read, "Personal transition to be delayed until executive stability objectives are no longer material to financing narrative." I read it again, then again. That was when the truth changed shape. Until that moment, part of me had been trying to construct innocent explanations. Maybe Beacon was a crisis management exercise. Maybe some consultant had written it without Ethan's knowledge. Maybe Vanessa's message referred to the exhausting schedule, the investor campaign, the pretending required at public events. Human beings are remarkably creative when the truth threatens something they desperately want to keep. We call it giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes what we are really giving them is more time to hurt us. I opened the email chain. Ethan had written most of it from his corporate account to Vanessa and an outside communications consultant named Philip Kessler. The earliest message was dated almost 4 months before Ethan proposed to me. 4 months. That number hurt more than I expected. In it, Philip recommended that Ethan stabilize personal optics before approaching several institutional investors who had previously raised concerns about his volatile lifestyle narrative. I knew what that meant. Ethan had been divorced twice. Underneath, there had been tabloid photographs years earlier with a television personality in Miami. Nothing criminal, nothing scandalous enough to destroy a career, but enough noise that conservative money apparently noticed. Vanessa replied that Ethan's relationship with me could solve the problem naturally. She described me as credible, mature, financially non-competitive, and unlikely to seek public attention. Financially non-competitive? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Sometimes your body reaches for laughter when anger would require too much energy. Ethan responded 13 minutes later, "Nora fits the life I need people to see." There it was. Not the woman I love, not the person I want beside me, the life I need people to see. I pushed away from the island and walked into the living room because suddenly I needed distance from the screen, as if 12 feet of hardwood could make the words less true. The house was silent except for the rain. My engagement photographs were sitting on the mantel because my mother had insisted I print them instead of leaving everything on my phone. In one, Ethan was looking at me while I laughed at something outside the frame. I picked it up. His expression looked genuine. That was what confused me. If he had looked cold, if there had been calculation visible in his eyes, this would have been easier, but life rarely gives betrayal the courtesy of making the past obvious. I still believe Ethan had feelings for me. Maybe he even loved me in whatever compartment of himself remained separate from ambition. But I had learned enough about business and marriage to understand that love does not automatically prevent exploitation. People can care about you and still decide their goals matter more than your dignity. That contradiction is why some betrayals take years to recover from. Hatred would be simpler. I returned to the laptop. There were more messages between Ethan and Vanessa, increasingly personal as the months passed. Nothing explicit enough to print on a billboard. No hotel receipts, no declarations of love, just familiarity, inside jokes, late-night messages that had nothing to do with Astor House. One from Vanessa after midnight. "You looked miserable at dinner tonight." Ethan. "I was sitting beside 3 lenders and pretending to enjoy myself." Vanessa. "Not the part I meant." Ethan responded with a single line. "I know." I felt something in my chest settle. Not break, settle. There was a point in some painful discoveries when your heart stops arguing with the evidence. The next message was the one I had already seen. Ethan wrote, "Once the deal closes, we won't need to keep pretending forever." Vanessa replied, 3 years isn't forever." But farther down the thread was something even worse. Vanessa asked, "And Nora?" Ethan answered, "She'll be protected. The prenup will make the separation clean. She has her own little life. She'll go back to it." My own little life. I sat there looking at those 4 words. Ethan had been inside my home. He had eaten dinner with my mother. He had slept beside me, proposed to me, discussed where we might spend Christmas when we were 70. And somehow, after all of that, he still thought he understood the size of my life because he knew the square footage of my townhouse and the age of my car. That is one of the most dangerous habits successful people develop. They become so accustomed to evaluating businesses, employees, markets, and competitors that eventually they begin evaluating human beings the same way. Then one day they confuse a limited amount of visible information with complete knowledge. I kept reading until I found the line that finally removed any remaining doubt about why our wedding date mattered. Philip had recommended delaying the investor roadshow if the ceremony moved. Ethan responded, "The wedding stays in October. It needs to precede the financing process." Needs to. I closed the laptop. It was after 1 in the morning. I poured myself water, stood at the sink, and watched rainwater gather along the glass doors leading to the patio. I thought about calling Ethan in Atlanta. I imagined his voice becoming careful. I imagined him explaining. I imagined myself asking questions I already knew the answers to. Confrontation is satisfying in stories because it happens quickly. Real life is different. Once you reveal what you know, you also reveal what the other person needs to hide. I had spent 25 years in business learning never to give someone information before deciding what I wanted to do with it. Pain did not suddenly make that lesson less useful. So I did something Ethan would never have expected. I said nothing. The next morning he called at 7:12 from Atlanta. "Morning, beautiful." I looked at the closed laptop on the kitchen table. "Morning. Sleep okay?" "Not really." He sighed. "Wedding stress?" I almost admired the irony. "Something like that." He told me he loved me before hanging up. I told him I loved him too, because at that moment, horribly enough, part of me still did. Then I waited until 8:30 and called Rachel Donnelly. She answered with, "If this is about changing the flowers again, I'm blocking you." "Rachel," I said. Something in my voice stopped her. "What happened?" I looked at the folder still open on my screen, at my photograph beside the words "Positive Stability Signal." "I need you to read something." "Send it." "No, I'm coming to your office." There was a pause. "How bad?" I picked up my keys. "Bad enough that I'm still getting married." Another pause, longer this time. "Nora, what are you talking about?" I closed the laptop, slipped it into my bag, and looked once at the engagement photograph on the mantel. "I need you to read a prenup that hasn't been written yet." Rachel Donnelly's office was on the 9th floor of a brick building in South Park, between a wealth management firm and an orthodontist, which always amused her because, as she once said, everyone on that floor made a living fixing things people wish they had handled earlier. I arrived a little after 9, with Ethan's laptop in my bag and enough coffee in me to make sleep irrelevant. Rachel took one look at my face, closed her office door, and turned her phone upside down on the desk. "Start from the beginning." I didn't. I opened Beacon. Sometimes pain makes chronology feel unnecessary. I showed her my photograph in the investor deck, the language about executive stability, the wedding timeline, the post-transaction phase, Vanessa's messages, and finally the sentence about me going back to my little life. Rachel read everything without interrupting. That alone frightened me. She had been my attorney through the sale of GridPath, 2 private acquisitions, my mother's estate planning, and one ugly dispute with a former partner. Rachel interrupted judges. She interrupted bankers. She interrupted me. But that morning she kept scrolling in silence until she reached the last email. Then she removed her glasses and said, "You're 6 weeks from the wedding." "A little less now." "And you're still considering going through with it?" I looked through the window at traffic moving along Sharon Road below us. "Yes." She stared at me. "Tell me why." I had spent the drive rehearsing answers that sounded intelligent. None of them survived her office. Because if I confront him today, I know exactly what happens. Which is? He says the consultants wrote the language. He says Beacon was about financing optics, not the marriage. He tells me Vanessa's messages were inappropriate but harmless. He apologizes for the wording, gives me just enough explanation to make me question what I saw, and suddenly I'm arguing about intent instead of facts. Rachel leaned back. "You already have facts." "I have enough to know he planned around me. I don't yet know how far that planning goes." "And marrying him gets you that answer?" "Maybe." She didn't like that. I could see it. "Nora, that sounds dangerously close to turning your own life into due diligence." "Maybe that's because due diligence is the one thing I know how to do when something valuable might be built on bad assumptions." The words came out colder than I felt. That was always the risk with me. People heard calm and assumed absence of pain. The truth was, I still loved him. That was the part I hated admitting. I still remember Charleston, the soup outside my door when I was sick, the hospital coffee for my mother, the way he reached for my hand in his sleep. Betrayal does not erase tenderness on command. If it did, heartbreak would be efficient. The mind can see danger while the heart is still standing in an old memory asking whether it really has to leave. "There's another reason," I said. Rachel waited. "The recapitalization." "Astor House." I nodded. $310 million. The wedding is built into their investor narrative. If I cancel 6 weeks before the ceremony, I don't just leave Ethan. I become the instability event Beacon already anticipated. That is not your responsibility. I know. Do you? I looked at her. I'm not protecting the deal. I'm protecting myself from becoming the explanation for whatever happens to it. That was the truth. If I walked away immediately, Ethan would have an easy story. Nora panicked. Nora hated public life. Nora couldn't handle the pressure surrounding a CEO. Every ugly thing I had just read could become more believable because I had reacted exactly when they expected a fragile fiancé to react. I wasn't willing to hand him that narrative before I knew what I wanted. Leaving quickly and leaving cleanly are not the same thing. I had learned that in business long before Ethan. Panic feels like action because it is loud, but speed is not always strength. Sometimes the stronger move is buying enough time to make sure the next decision belongs to you. Rachel studied me for several seconds. So what do you want from me? I want to know what happens if he asks for a prenup. Has he? Not yet. Beacon says marital asset protection finalized before the wedding. Exactly. Rachel reopened the file, then pulled a legal pad toward her. All right, if he sends one, we review every line. You disclose everything required. No hiding assets, no moving money, no games. Agreed. And if it is unfair, we negotiate. I hesitated. Maybe. Her pen stopped. Maybe? If he writes a mutual agreement that keeps premarital property separate, keeps appreciation separate, protects individually funded investments, and applies the same rules to both of us. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. Then the terms may hurt the woman he thinks you are and protect the woman you actually are. Yes. She leaned back slowly. You want him to choose the rules while he still thinks he's the only one with something worth protecting. I want to see what he believes fairness looks like when he thinks fairness benefits him. That was different from revenge, although I knew the line between the two was thinner than I wanted to admit. Rachel must have seen it in my face because she said, "Be careful, Nora. Strategy is where you go when emotion scares you." I know. Do you? I'm sitting here instead of throwing his laptop through a window. That is not the same thing as being okay. I looked down at my hands. She was right. I wasn't okay. But being hurt did not require me to become careless. We spent the next 2 hours reconstructing my financial life. Cedarvale Partners, the Grid Path sale, commercial real estate, private credit, a data center investment in Virginia, municipal bonds, treasury holdings, a trust that had reverted to me after my mother died, a small apartment property outside Raleigh that I owned with my brother. Individually, none of it looked like the fantasy version of wealth Ethan understood from hotel openings and glossy magazines. Together, depending on private valuations, it put my net worth somewhere around $62 million. Rachel stopped writing. And Ethan thinks? I honestly don't know what number he has in his head, but not 62. No. How does someone marry you without asking? I looked at her. Because he thinks he already knows. That was the deeper wound, not the money. If Ethan had misunderstood my accounts, I could have laughed about that someday. What hurt was realizing how easily he had mistaken simplicity for limitation. I drove a 6-year-old Volvo because it worked. I lived in the townhouse I bought before Grid Path became valuable because I loved the neighborhood. I worked fewer hours because I had spent 20 years earning the right to choose my time. Ethan saw all of that and translated it into smaller. People do that constantly. They see someone quiet and assume weak, someone private and assume unimportant, someone content and assume they failed to achieve more. We tend to recognize power only when it announces itself. Ethan's mistake was not unusual. It was just expensive. Almost a month passed before he mentioned the prenup. During that month, I gave him every opportunity to become the man I hoped I had misunderstood. We tasted wedding cakes. We argued about whether 84 guests still counted as a small wedding. He helped my mother choose a hotel room in Charleston. He took 2 calls from Vanessa during dinner and turned his phone face down both times. I watched. I waited. I hated myself a little for waiting. Then, 12 days before the wedding, Ethan called from his office. "Martin finished something I want us to review." "What?" "A prenup." There was no surprise left in me. "Okay." He seemed relieved. "I booked a private room at Hartwell tomorrow night. We'll go through it together." "Sounds good." The moment we hung up, I called Rachel. "It's here." "I know. Martin emailed it 11 minutes ago." She read all 26 pages that night. At 10:24, my phone rang. "Nora, tell me." Premarital assets separate, appreciation separate, individually titled investments separate, income from separate assets remains separate, future acquisitions made with traceable separate funds remain separate. Mutual? Completely mutual. I closed my eyes. "So?" Rachel was quiet for a beat. "For the woman he believes he's marrying, this agreement is a fortress around him. And for me, it's a fortress around you too. Disclosure? Full and clean. I'm sending everything required. Cedarvale, grid path, the entities, the valuations we can support. Martin will have every opportunity to read it." "Good." "Nora, if Ethan actually reads the disclosure, the game changes tomorrow." I looked toward the guest room where my wedding dress hung behind a closed door. "Then let him read it." Rachel sent the disclosures. Martin's office acknowledged receipt the next afternoon. Ethan never called with a single question, not one. At dinner the following night, he slid the Navy folder across the table and said, "I'm not risking my future on you." By then, I understood something I hadn't understood when I first opened Beacon. Ethan's greatest weakness was not ambition, it was certainty. His lawyer had placed the truth in front of him, and certainty convinced him there was no reason to look closely. So when he signed the agreement first and pushed the pen toward me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad for the part of me that had once wanted him to know me without being forced to. I signed beneath his name. 12 days later, beneath white oak trees outside Charleston, I became Nora Weller. Ethan believed he had protected his future from me. 4 months after the wedding, one of Astor House's earliest investors quietly decided to sell part of his stake, and Cedarvale Partners received a call that neither Ethan nor I had planned for. 4 months after our wedding, a man named Howard Bell decided he wanted out of Astor House. I had met Howard exactly once, at the reception after our ceremony in Charleston. He was 67, soft-spoken, wore an old-fashioned gold watch, and had been one of Ethan's earliest investors back when Astor House was 2 renovated buildings and a promise. He kissed my cheek, told me Ethan was a difficult man worth betting on, then disappeared into the crowd before I could decide whether it was a compliment. I didn't think about him again until Rachel called me on a Monday morning in February. "Does the name Howard Bell mean anything to you?" she asked. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, spreading almond butter on toast while Ethan was upstairs packing for Atlanta. "Early Astor House investor?" "Very early. He owns a little over 6%. "Why are you asking?" Rachel paused. "Because he's quietly shopping part of it." I stopped moving. "How quietly?" "Quiet enough that Cedarvale was approached through an intermediary who apparently has no idea you're married to Ethan." I looked toward the staircase. I could hear Ethan opening and closing drawers upstairs. "How much?" "Howard wants to sell roughly half his position. The block is valued somewhere around $8 million, depending on the final terms." I set the knife down. There are opportunities that feel like opportunities the moment they arrive. This one didn't. It felt dangerous. Not because buying the stake was wrong. Cedarvale invested in private companies all the time. Astor House was profitable, growing, and preparing for a financing event that could increase its value substantially. On paper, it was exactly the kind of investment my team would have considered, even if I had never met Ethan. What made it complicated was that I had met him. I had married him. I had read Beacon. "I don't want revenge money," I said. Rachel understood immediately. "Then don't treat it as revenge." "That's easy to say." "Nora, the question isn't whether Ethan would hate discovering you owned part of his company. The question is whether Cedarvale would buy this stake if his name meant nothing to you." I hated when Rachel made things simple. Simple questions are dangerous because they leave fewer places to hide. "Probably," I said. Then have the investment committee evaluate it without you. That was what we did. I recused myself from the initial review. Cedar Vale's managing director, Marcus Lee, and 2 outside advisors evaluated occupancy trends, debt structure, property-level cash flow, management quality, expansion plans, and the proposed recapitalization. They knew I was connected personally to the company, but I did not tell them what outcome I wanted, because I didn't know what outcome I wanted. 2 weeks later, Marcus called. "Financially," he said, "I like it. Risks? CEO concentration, aggressive expansion, some leverage I'd watch, but the assets are good and the brand has room. Would you buy? At the right price." I sat in my office at Cedar Vale staring at a framed photograph of GridPath's first 12 employees. We had taken it in a warehouse outside Raleigh 20 years earlier, all of us younger, tired, and pretending we weren't terrified. I had built my life by making decisions with incomplete information. The difference now was that every number had a face attached to it. People love saying business isn't personal, usually right before doing something deeply personal in a conference room. The truth is that business is full of human emotion wearing spreadsheets as armor. Fear becomes a discount rate, ego becomes an acquisition, loyalty becomes a retention package, and sometimes betrayal becomes a reason to read the footnotes more carefully. "Proceed," I told Marcus, "but ordinary terms. No special treatment because of me." Cedar Vale purchased just under 3% of Astor House through a private investment vehicle whose ownership was disclosed where required but did not put my name on Ethan's desk. It wasn't control. It wasn't even influence yet. It was a seat several rooms away from the room where decisions were made. And strangely, when the papers were finalized, I didn't feel powerful. I felt sad. The man sleeping beside me had once made me believe being married meant building something together. Now I owned part of his company through an entity he had never cared enough to understand. 2 nights after the closing, Ethan came home carrying Thai food and a bottle of wine. "Good week?" I asked. "Better than good." He loosened his tie and kissed my forehead. Howard Bell finally reduced his position. I kept opening containers. "Is that good?" "Long term, yes. He's been wanting liquidity forever. New money coming in is healthier." "Do you know who bought it?" Ethan shrugged. "Some investment group, Cedar Vale or Cedar Ridge, something like that." I looked at him. "Cedar Vale? That's it." He poured wine. "You've heard of them?" There are moments when the truth is sitting so close to the surface that one careless breath could expose everything. I could have told him then. I could have watched his face change. Instead, I put rice on my plate. "The name sounds familiar." Ethan nodded and moved on. That was all. My husband had just discussed my own family office with me and never considered that the woman across the table might know more about it than he did. It should have felt funny. It didn't. Underestimation only feels flattering from a distance. Up close, especially from someone who claims to love you, it can feel almost like invisibility. A month later, another opportunity arrived, this one through Astor House's debt rather than its equity. 2 of the company's properties, a converted textile mill in Greenville and a resort outside Savannah, had been financed through a private credit vehicle that was reducing hospitality exposure. Cedar Vale already knew the fund manager. Marcus brought the transaction to me with a look that said he understood the irony before either of us spoke. "You want me out of this one?" I asked. "I want you aware of it." We reviewed the debt independently. The properties were performing. The terms were attractive. Cedar Vale participated in a syndicate refinancing a portion of the loans. Again, nothing controlling, nothing hidden from regulators or counsel, just capital moving where capital saw opportunity. Ethan came home the week the refinancing closed, looking lighter than I had seen him in months. He dropped his briefcase near the kitchen door and opened the refrigerator. "We finally stabilized Greenville and Savannah," he said. "That financing issue I've been fighting. I was chopping rosemary for dinner." "That's good." "It's huge. Vanessa found a group willing to come into the credit structure." I kept chopping. "Smart group?" "Apparently." He took a sparkling water from the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. "Family office money. Patient capital. Exactly what we needed." "Patient capital." I almost smiled. "Then you should sleep better." "Maybe for one night." He kissed my temple and went upstairs to shower. I stood there with Rosemary on the cutting board and listened to his footsteps disappear. I didn't want Astor House to fail. That matters. Ethan employed almost 2,000 people by then. Housekeepers, bartenders, cooks, maintenance workers, managers, accountants. They had mortgages and children and dental appointments. They hadn't lied to me. Revenge that burns innocent people just to make one guilty person warm is not justice. It is ego. So whenever Cedarvale touched Astor House, I insisted the investment had to make business sense on its own. If helping the company also placed me closer to the truth, I could live with that. What I hadn't expected was how naturally Ethan would begin telling me about the very problems my money was quietly helping solve. Over dinner, he complained about lender covenants. On Sunday mornings, he talked through property performance. He told me Charleston margins were improving. He told me Savannah needed renovation capital. He told me which investors were nervous and which board members were impatient. I listened the way I always had. I asked ordinary questions. Sometimes I hated myself for how easy the performance became. Then I remembered Beacon and wondered which one of us had begun performing first. The answer came one Thursday evening in April. We were sitting on the back patio after dinner when Ethan mentioned Vanessa had been distracted all week. Personal issue? I asked. Business, actually. She's launching something on the side. Real estate syndicate. Small luxury properties, adaptive reuse. I kept my face neutral. Sounds ambitious. She's good enough to pull it off. She just needs an anchor investor. My phone was lying face down beside my glass. Earlier that morning, Marcus had sent me a new opportunity Cedarvale had received through a broker in Atlanta. Boutique Real Estate Syndicate, Adaptive Reuse, founder Vanessa Cole. I looked at Ethan across the table, at the man who still thought Cedarvale was simply some anonymous pool of patient money somewhere far from our marriage. I hope she finds one, I said. Ethan smiled. She will. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip. He had no idea how right he was. 3 days after Ethan mentioned that Vanessa was looking for an anchor investor, Marcus walked into my office carrying a thin black folder and said, "You're going to hate how good this deal looks." I was standing by the window at Cedarvale, watching a steady rain darken the streets below. "Her fund?" I asked. He nodded. 12 million target, 2 properties to start, one in Durham, one outside Charleston. She needs 3 million from one investor to make the rest of the raise easier. I took the folder but didn't open it. Would we touch it if her name wasn't on the front? Marcus gave me the answer I needed. Yes, not blindly, but yes. That was the line I refused to cross from the beginning. I was not going to turn Cedarvale into a weapon just because I had been hurt. Money can become revenge very easily when the person controlling it stops asking whether the decision still makes sense without the anger attached. I had seen men buy companies they didn't want just to beat rivals they hated. I had seen founders destroy value because admitting someone else was right felt worse than losing millions. Pain makes people confuse motion with control. I did not want that happening to me. Then evaluate it exactly the way you would any other deal, I said. I don't sit on the investment vote. Marcus studied me. You sure? Completely. And if it passes? Then Cedarvale invests. He nodded and left. 2 weeks later, the committee approved it. Cedarvale joined 2 other investors and committed $3 million to Vanessa's first real estate vehicle. That was all the audience needed to understand, and honestly, it was all I allowed myself to think about too. Vanessa needed money, Cedarvale had money, and the investment made sense. I did not call her. I did not negotiate with her. She dealt with Marcus and outside counsel. As far as Vanessa knew, she had secured backing from a private family office in Charlotte with a long-term investment horizon. She had no idea the woman controlling that family office was the same woman whose husband she had been planning a future with. The absurdity of it hit me 2 nights later. Ethan came home earlier than usual, loosened his tie in the kitchen, and opened a bottle of wine before I had finished setting dinner on the table. "Vanessa closed her anchor," he said. He sounded relieved, proud even. "That's good," I said. 3 million, family office money. Apparently they liked the Charleston project enough to move fast. I sat across from him. Who? Cedarvale. I let a second pass. Same Cedarvale that bought part of Howard Bell's stake? Yeah, he laughed. They're showing up everywhere lately. Maybe they're good at what they do. Apparently. He took a sip of wine. Vanessa says they're disciplined, no drama, no ego. I looked down at my plate because if I looked directly at him, I might have smiled. No drama, no ego. Ethan was praising my company without knowing it was mine. More than that, he was praising the very qualities he had mistaken for weakness in me. Quiet, patient, disciplined. That was the strange cruelty of being underestimated by someone close to you. When strangers do it, it can be useful. When your husband does it, it feels less like an advantage and more like proof that he has been living beside a person he never bothered to study. Sounds like the kind of investor you want, I said. Exactly. Then he changed the subject. That was Ethan. Once a problem looked solved, he moved on quickly. Over the next few months, Cedarvale's position around Astor House became important in ways that were easy to understand even if the details were not. We owned a small piece of the company. We had money tied to financing 2 of its properties. And now Vanessa's new venture depended in part on our capital. None of that gave me control over Ethan. I didn't want control. It gave me something more practical. Independence, visibility, and enough distance from his decisions that if his plan ever turned against me, I would not be standing there empty-handed. Marcus also made one thing very clear after our first Astor House investment. Any information Ethan casually shared with me at home stayed out of Cedarvale's decisions. I was removed from votes involving his company, and our compliance team documented it. If Ethan complained about occupancy over dinner, that was my husband talking to his wife, not investment research. I needed that separation as much for myself as for anyone else. The moment I started using private conversations as business intelligence, I would become the thing Ethan had apparently assumed I already was, someone waiting to profit from the marriage. I refused to give him that truth retroactively. At home, life continued with a strange normality. We attended an Astor House opening in Nashville. We spent Thanksgiving with his sister. We went to Charleston for a board dinner where Vanessa sat 3 seats away from me and talked about restoration costs on an old warehouse she wanted to convert into a hotel. She was polite, warm even. At one point, she touched my arm and said, "You must be so proud of Ethan. This recapitalization is going to change everything." I remember thinking, yes, it is, just not the way you think. I didn't hate Vanessa the way I expected to. That surprised me. Maybe because by then I understood she wasn't the center of the betrayal, Ethan was. It would have been convenient to turn her into the villain and make myself feel simpler, but she had never promised me anything. Ethan had. The older I got, the less interested I became in blaming the easiest person. Betrayal usually has a clear center if you are willing to look at it without protecting the person you love. One Saturday morning, Ethan sat across from me at breakfast scrolling through emails and said, "The board finally stopped panicking about the debt structure." Good. Greenville and Savannah are stable. That Cedarvale group helped more than I expected. Glad to hear it. He looked up. You've been asking a lot more questions about the company lately. My pulse jumped once. I'm married to the CEO. It would be nice to understand the thing that steals you from dinner 4 nights a week. He smiled, completely satisfied. Fair. Then he returned to his phone. Confidence is one of the best hiding places for the truth. Ethan had already decided what kind of woman I was, so any evidence that didn't fit simply bent itself around the story in his head. If you've ever had someone close to you underestimate you, tell me what country you're listening from and what you would have done in my place, because by then, even I was starting to wonder how long silence could remain strength before it turned into permission. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel called just before 5. I closed my office door. What happened? We found another Beacon folder. My stomach tightened. Another one? Linked archive. Your original copy didn't download it. What's inside? She was quiet for a second. Post-separation messaging. I sat down. Explain. Talking points for the board, investor language, draft statements. The plan wasn't only to leave you after the transaction. It was to control why everyone thought the marriage ended. I said nothing. Nora, the story they prepared is that you couldn't adjust to executive life. that you wanted privacy, that you chose to step away. A cold anger moved through me, not jealousy, not grief, something cleaner. Ethan wasn't just planning to use me until I stopped being useful. He was planning to make my disappearance look voluntary. And Vanessa? I asked. Barely mentioned. Of course. Ethan would remain the stable CEO. Vanessa would remain untouched. I would become the woman who simply couldn't handle his world. There are betrayals that hurt because someone lies to you. This was different. He had already written the lie he planned to tell about me after I was gone. When does formal due diligence start? I asked. Monday. I looked through the glass wall of my office at Marcus walking past, Cedarvale operating normally around me, people working, phones ringing, numbers moving. Then Monday we stopped letting Ethan guess who Cedarvale belongs to. Rachel paused. You're sure? I looked down at my wedding ring. Yes. For months I had protected myself by staying quiet. Now the truth was about to enter the room on paper, and for the first time Ethan would have to meet the woman he had already decided he understood. I spent that Tuesday night reading the version of my divorce Ethan had already written for me. Not the legal version. That would have almost been easier. Legal documents at least admit what they are. They use cold words because nobody expects warmth from them. What Rachel sent me was worse because it was designed to sound human. There were draft statements for the board, talking points for investors, possible answers if reporters ever asked why Ethan Weller's marriage had ended so soon after Astor House completed the biggest transaction in its history. One paragraph said we had grown in different directions. Another described me as someone who never fully adjusted to the public demands of executive life. A third suggested I had always preferred a quiet existence in Charlotte and had ultimately chosen to return to it. Chosen. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at that word until it stopped looking like English. Ethan was upstairs taking a shower. I could hear water moving through the pipes, drawers opening, the familiar sounds of a man preparing for bed in the same house where his wife was reading the story he planned to tell after leaving her. The person closest to you has already rehearsed your absence. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels administrative, like someone has removed your name from a reservation you didn't know was temporary. I kept reading. There were notes about my limited social media presence, my reluctance to attend certain Astor House events, my preference for smaller dinners instead of large galas. All true. That was what made the plan so effective. The best lies are rarely invented from nothing. They are built from true pieces arranged in a dishonest order. Ethan wasn't going to say I was unstable or cruel. He was too smart for that. He was going to take the parts of me he had once claimed to love, my privacy, my independence, my lack of interest in attention, and turn them into evidence that I had never belonged in his life. According to one draft, he would remain deeply respectful of Nora's desire to step away from the demands surrounding Astor House. I whispered the sentence out loud in the empty kitchen and nearly laughed. Step away. As though I would quietly pick up my coat after 3 years, thank everyone for having me, and disappear so Ethan and Vanessa could enter the next phase without a stain on the carpet. The shower stopped upstairs. I closed the laptop. By the time Ethan came down in a t-shirt and gray sweatpants, I was standing at the counter pouring sparkling water over ice. You okay? He asked. Long day. Cedarvale stuff? My hand paused for maybe half a second. Ethan didn't notice. Some investment work. He opened the refrigerator and took out leftover pasta. You should slow down. That little office of yours keeps you busier than you admit. Little office. I looked at him. He was smiling. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. Maybe, I said. He kissed my cheek and carried the container upstairs. I stood there listening to his footsteps fade. For months, I had thought Ethan's greatest mistake was underestimating my money. That night, I understood it was deeper than money. He underestimated my interior life, my memory, my patience, my ability to understand what was being done to me without immediately announcing that I understood. Money was simply the easiest measurement of how little curiosity he had ever shown. He had never asked how Cedarvale worked because he assumed it was small. He had never asked why I had left GridPath, because he assumed I had simply gotten tired. He never asked why I drove an old Volvo, or why I preferred my townhouse to one of his larger properties. He interpreted every choice through the lens that made him larger. People do that more often than they realize. They don't always diminish you deliberately. Sometimes they simply build a version of you that makes their own importance easier to believe. I went upstairs around midnight. Ethan was already asleep on his side, one hand under the pillow. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have. I remembered the first winter we dated, when I got sick after Christmas and he drove 3 hours through freezing rain because I mentioned I had no groceries. He left soup, oranges, medicine, and a handwritten note outside my door because I told him not to come inside. I still had the note somewhere. For a long time after finding Beacon, I had tried to decide whether that man had been real or whether every kindness had been part of some early calculation. That was the wrong question. People are not usually one thing. Ethan could have cared about me and still used me. He could have meant the soup and still meant the strategy deck. We like betrayal to be clean because clean betrayal allows clean hatred. Real betrayal is harder. Sometimes the person who hurts you is also the person who once sat beside your mother in a hospital waiting room and made her laugh when she was afraid. You don't recover by pretending the good moments never happened. You recover by accepting that good moments do not excuse what came after them. I changed clothes, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling. Ethan shifted toward me in his sleep and rested his hand lightly against my hip. I nearly cried then. Not because I wanted to save the marriage. I think some part of me already knew it was beyond saving. I cried because there was still muscle memory between us. Bodies can remember tenderness long after trust has died. I moved his hand gently, went downstairs, and sat on the back patio until almost 2 in the morning. The air was cool. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked once and stopped. I thought about leaving that night. I could have packed a bag, gone to a hotel, called Rachel in the morning, and let the entire thing burn behind me. There would have been dignity in that, maybe even relief. But then I thought about the draft statements. Nora chose to step away. If I disappeared before the financing process, Ethan would be handed exactly the ending he had prepared. He would absorb my pain into his narrative and call the result unfortunate. I wasn't staying because I wanted revenge. I was staying because I wanted my own actions to belong to me. There is a difference. The next morning, I called Rachel before 7. I read everything. I figured you would. How much of it can become relevant during diligence? The governance material? Potentially a lot. The personal messaging? Only if it intersects with disclosures, conflicts, or representations they've made. We are not dumping private emails into somebody's lap for drama. Good. Nora, listen to me. We stay clean. We stay clean. She paused. Formal diligence begins Monday. Cedarvale will have to certify beneficial ownership in the equity vehicle and disclose your control position where required. The credit participation will also be traced. Depending on how deeply they examine related exposure, Vanessa's syndicate may surface too. So Ethan finds out Monday? Not necessarily Monday. Documents move through lawyers, lenders, compliance teams, but once the certifications go in, the clock starts. I looked out through the kitchen window. Ethan's car was still in the driveway. Then submit everything. You're certain? Yes. Rachel was quiet for a moment. How are you? I almost gave her the automatic answer, fine. Instead, I looked at the 2 coffee mugs beside the sink, Ethan's dark blue one and my chipped white one, ordinary evidence of a marriage that still existed on paper and in routine. I'm grieving someone who's still upstairs, I said. Rachel didn't rush to fill the silence. That was why I trusted her. That may be the most honest thing you've said since this started, she said finally. Monday came without thunder. Ethan left at 6:30 for an investor breakfast, wearing a navy suit and the cufflinks I had given him for his birthday. He kissed me at the door. Big week, he said. I know. Wish me luck. I looked at him for a second longer than usual. Good luck. At 9:05, Rachel emailed me a single sentence. Beneficial ownership certification submitted. I sat alone in my Cedarvale office and read it twice. Nothing had exploded. No phone rang. No dramatic message arrived. Somewhere across Charlotte, teams of attorneys and analysts were opening folders, checking names, tracing entities, comparing disclosures. That was all. Truth rarely enters a room with music. Usually it arrives as paperwork. At 4:17 that afternoon, Rachel called again. "They've acknowledged receipt." "Anything else?" "One question from outside counsel." "What question?" I heard papers moving on her end. "They want a complete, consolidated schedule of your Cedar Vale holdings and related investment interests." I leaned back in my chair. "Everything?" "Everything." I looked through the glass wall at my staff, working quietly beyond it. 6 years of investments: the GridPath sale, real estate, private credit, Astor House equity, Vanessa's fund, the life Ethan had reduced to a townhouse, an old car, and some consulting. "How long will it be?" I asked. Rachel gave a short laugh. "At least 60 pages. "Send it." "Nora, once they read this, there's no going back to the version of you Ethan believes in." I looked down at my wedding ring, then slowly turned it once around my finger. "Rachel," I said, "that version of me never existed." 2 days later, she called with the final count, 63 pages, and somewhere inside Ethan's lawyer's office, my husband was about to discover that the woman he had built an exit strategy around had been living an entirely different life right beside him. The 63-page disclosure left Rachel's office at 9:08 on a Thursday morning. By noon, 3 different law firms had opened it. By 3, Ethan's attorneys had downloaded it twice. I know that because Rachel called me at 3:17 and said, "Martin Hale's office just requested the exhibits again." I was sitting in a conference room at Cedar Vale with a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. "Maybe the first copy was blurry," I said. Rachel laughed once. "Nora, nothing was blurry." Page 1 identified Cedar Vale Partners and listed me as its controlling principal. Page 6 summarized the GridPath sale. Page 11 showed my commercial real estate interests. Pages 18 through 27 covered private investments, bonds, and credit positions. Page 34 documented Cedar Vale's indirect ownership interest in Astor House. Page 41 laid out our participation in the Greenville and Savannah financing. And page 52 connected one of our real estate vehicles to Vanessa Cole's syndicate. Nothing hidden, nothing theatrical, just 63 pages of facts Ethan had spent 2 years being too certain to ask about. The estimated range at the end put my personal net worth between $61 and $64 million, depending on private company valuations. Ethan's lawyers had possessed most of the underlying disclosure since before the wedding. That detail mattered to me more than the number. I had not tricked my husband into signing something blind. I had not moved assets after the fact or hidden money in some cartoonish offshore account. His attorney had received what was required. Ethan simply believed the prenup existed to protect him, so he never became curious about what it might protect on my side. That is the trouble with arrogance. It doesn't always make people loud. Sometimes it makes them lazy. At 4:02, Rachel called again. "Martin wants a call." "With you?" "With both of us." "Today?" He used the phrase, "at your earliest convenience," which in lawyer means 5 minutes ago. I looked through the conference room glass at Marcus talking with an analyst. "Set it for 5. At 5:03, Rachel joined from her office, I joined from Cedar Vale, and Martin Hale appeared on screen, looking 10 years older than he had at our prenup signing. Another attorney sat beside him, a woman named Susan Park from the outside firm handling Astor House's recapitalization. Martin began carefully. "Nora, thank you for making time." "Of course." "We've been reviewing the beneficial ownership materials. I assumed you had." His eyes flickered for half a second. "There are holdings here that are considerably more substantial than we understood." Rachel leaned slightly toward her camera. "More substantial than Ethan understood, Martin. Your office received Nora's premarital disclosure." Silence. "Certain entity valuations were presented as ranges." "Because they were private assets," Rachel said, "supported by schedules you acknowledged receiving." Susan stepped in before Martin could answer. "We're not questioning compliance. We're trying to understand related exposure for the transaction." That was a better question, so I answered it. Cedar Vale's Astor House stake was passive. Our private credit participation was arm's length. Vanessa's fund investment had been evaluated independently. I had no operational authority over Astor House and had never used my position to influence Ethan or company decisions. Susan asked precise questions for 20 minutes. I respected her immediately. She didn't care about my marriage. She cared whether the financing had hidden conflicts. By the end, she seemed satisfied enough to move forward with additional review. Martin, however, stayed unusually quiet. Finally, he cleared his throat. "There's also the marital agreement." Rachel looked at me. I said nothing. Martin continued, "Given the difference between the financial assumptions at the time and what is now apparent, Ethan may wish to revisit certain provisions." I actually thought I had misheard him. "Financial assumptions?" I asked. The agreement was negotiated under a particular understanding of the parties' relative positions. Rachel's expression changed. It was subtle, but I had seen it before. It meant someone had just said something they would regret. "The agreement was drafted by your office," she said. "Your client proposed the separate property structure. My client accepted it after full disclosure." "I understand that. Then what exactly needs revisiting?" Martin hesitated. There are silences in negotiations that contain more truth than answers. Finally, he said, "I'm simply suggesting there may be value in discussing whether the existing arrangement still reflects the parties' intentions." I looked at the man who had sat beside Ethan 12 days before our wedding while my future husband explained that he was not risking his future on me. "It reflects Ethan's intentions perfectly," I said. Martin looked directly into the camera. "Nora, he wanted his premarital property protected. So did I. He wanted appreciation on individually held assets to remain separate. So did I. He wanted separately funded acquisitions to remain separate. I signed what he asked for." "Circumstances are different now." "No," I said. "The circumstances were always these. Ethan's knowledge of them is what changed." Nobody spoke for several seconds. I felt no rush of victory. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment during sleepless nights, imagined Ethan's lawyers discovering the truth, imagined some satisfying sense of balance returning to the universe. Instead, I felt tired. Vindication is less glamorous when the person being proven wrong is someone you once planned to grow old beside. Martin finally asked whether I would consider an amendment. I looked at Rachel, then back at him. "No." "You don't want time to think about it?" "I had time before I signed." We ended the call at 5:41. Rachel stayed connected after Martin and Susan dropped off. She leaned back in her chair. "You okay?" "Ask me tomorrow." "That bad?" "That empty," she nodded. "For what it's worth, you handled it exactly right." I looked at the 63-page binder on the table. "Do you think Ethan knows yet?" "Martin'll call him tonight if he hasn't already." I drove home just after 7. Ethan wasn't there. His calendar said investor dinner, though I no longer trusted calendars as evidence of much. I made scrambled eggs because I didn't have the energy to cook anything that required judgment. At 8:26, he texted, "Running late, don't wait up." At 8:31, another message appeared. "Love you." I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I put the phone face down. He came home after 11. I heard the garage door, his keys, the quiet movement downstairs. I stayed in bed and pretended to be asleep. Ethan stood in the bedroom doorway for several seconds. I could feel him looking at me. Then he went into the bathroom and closed the door. He didn't say anything that night. Not about Cedarvale, not about 63 pages, not about the fact that his wife was worth nearly 3 times what he believed. That silence told me Martin had called. Ethan was calculating. I knew the habit because I had watched him do it before acquisitions. When surprised, he didn't react. He gathered information until he could control the next conversation. The difference was that this time, I knew the information he was missing. Friday morning, he left before 6. No kiss, no note. At 10:14, Rachel forwarded an email from Martin requesting copies of the original GridPath transaction documents and confirmation that Cedarvale's Astor House position had been purchased using funds traceable to my separate property. We provided both. At 11:52, they requested another schedule. At 1:06, another. Every answer led back to the same conclusion. The assets were mine before Ethan, the capital was separate, The prenup he demanded preserved it. By Monday, the questions stopped. Tuesday was silent. Wednesday morning, Susan Park emailed Rachel, confirming that diligence could proceed subject to ordinary final review. I remember thinking that was probably the end of the immediate drama. I was wrong. At 2:17 that afternoon, my security camera alerted me that the front door had opened. Ethan never came home before 7. Never. I checked the image. There he was, walking inside in his dark suit, carrying no briefcase. When I pulled into the driveway 40 minutes later, his car was already there. I entered through the kitchen door and found him sitting at the table where we normally ate breakfast. No laptop, no phone, no wine. Just Ethan and the 63-page disclosure spread neatly in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his face that ambition had never allowed me to see before. Uncertainty. I put my keys on the counter. "You're home early." Ethan rested one hand on the binder. "What is Cedarvale?" he asked. And just like that, after months of silence, my husband finally became curious about his wife. "What is Cedarvale?" Ethan asked. I closed the kitchen door behind me and set my purse on the counter. The 63-page disclosure was spread across the table in neat sections, yellow tabs sticking from the side where someone, probably Martin, had marked the parts Ethan needed to understand. Grid path, real estate, private credit, Astor House, Vanessa. My entire financial life had been reduced to paper, and for the first time since we met, my husband had finally taken the time to read it. "You know what Cedarvale is," I said. "I know what the documents say." His voice was controlled, but there was tension underneath it now, the kind I had heard when an acquisition was going badly. "I'm asking you." I walked to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and poured myself a glass. I needed something ordinary to do with my hands. "It's my family office." "Your family office?" "Yes." "You control it?" "Yes." He looked down at the binder, then back at me. $63 million? Depending on valuations. "Nora, you asked." He stood. "How did I not know this?" There it was. Not why didn't you tell me? How did I not know? The distinction mattered. Ethan was still experiencing the discovery primarily as a failure of his own information system. "You did know," I said. "The disclosure was sent before we signed the prenup." "Not like this. The entities were listed, the sale was documented, your lawyer had everything he needed to ask questions. You told me you did some consulting." "I do." "You let me believe you were living off investments from a small exit." I studied him for a moment. "I never said small." He opened his mouth, then stopped. That was the first crack. Not in his anger, in his certainty. He walked to the window, pressed both hands against the back of a chair, and stared outside. It was late afternoon, sunlight cutting through the trees behind the house, making everything look warmer than it felt. Cedarvale bought Howard Bell's stake. Part of it. And Greenville, Savannah. We participated in the credit structure. He turned. Vanessa's fund. A Cedarvale vehicle invested alongside other parties. His face changed at her name, barely, but I saw it. "You invested in Vanessa?" "We invested in a real estate vehicle that passed independent review." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Talk to me like I'm one of your analysts." I almost smiled at the irony. "You've been talking about me like I was one of your investor relations problems for nearly 2 years." Silence. Ethan's eyes sharpened. "What does that mean?" I could have made him work for it. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I put the glass down. "Beacon." I watched recognition move across his face before he could hide it. His shoulders stiffened, his mouth opened slightly, then nothing. That silence answered questions I had spent months pretending might still have innocent explanations. "How long?" he asked finally. 6 weeks before the wedding. Ethan sat down slowly. "You saw the deck?" "Yes." "How much of it?" "All of it." "The emails?" "Those too." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, he looked older. "And you still married me?" "Yes." "Why?" It was the question Rachel had asked months earlier, but it sounded different coming from him. Rachel had asked because she feared I was hurting myself. Ethan asked because he was trying to understand how long he had been operating without control. At first, I said, because some part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation that wasn't as ugly as it looked. Nora, don't. You asked. He stopped. Then I realized canceling the wedding would give you exactly what you needed. An unstable fiancé, a damaged financing narrative, a story about how I couldn't handle your life. His jaw tightened. That wasn't what Beacon was. There was a section called post-separation messaging, Ethan. He looked away. That came from consultants. Consultants don't know I prefer small dinners unless someone tells them. He said nothing. They didn't know I avoided certain public events unless someone told them. They didn't know I wanted privacy unless someone gave them that language. And they certainly didn't decide on their own that, after the financing closed, I would conveniently step away from the demands of your world. It was contingency planning. I laughed then, once, quietly. You had a contingency plan for my personality. That's not fair. No. Fair would have been telling the woman you were asking to marry that her wedding date was helping your investors sleep better. He pushed away from the table. I loved you. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Maybe because I believed there had been truth in it. I think you did, I said. He stared at me, confused by the answer. Then why are you doing this? Doing what? He gestured toward the disclosure. Buying into my company? My debt? Vanessa's fund, sitting across from me every night while you built positions around my business. Every investment passed independent review. That isn't what I asked. Then ask the real question. His voice rose for the first time. Was this revenge? I looked at the man I had married and felt something strange settle inside me. Months earlier, that question might have made me defensive. Now it only made me tired. No, I said. It was insurance. Against what? Against waking up 3 years from now and finding out you had already decided what my life would look like after you were finished using it. His face tightened. I never used you. You called me a stability signal. That was corporate language. You scheduled our wedding around a financing process. The timing helped, yes, but that doesn't mean the marriage wasn't real. And Vanessa? That stopped him. There are questions people answer with their faces before their mouths catch up. Ethan looked toward the window. Nothing happened. That wasn't my question. There was no affair. Were you planning a life with her after me? He rubbed a hand across his jaw. Things were complicated. No. Complicated is when two honest people want different things. You had a timeline. It wasn't fixed. 30 to 36 months. Nora, 3 years isn't forever. His eyes snapped to mine. I watched him understand exactly how much I had read. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I remembered Vanessa ordering my wine before I sat down. Ethan turning his phone face down at dinner. Every tiny moment I had refused to turn into an accusation because I wanted facts instead of fear. Facts had finally arrived, and they were somehow less satisfying than uncertainty. How much are you worth? He asked suddenly. I almost couldn't believe it. After everything, that was where his mind went. Apparently enough that your lawyers finally read my paperwork. I'm serious. So am I. He looked at the binder again. You have more than I do. This was never a competition. You let me think you needed me. I held his gaze. No, Ethan, you decided that all by yourself. Something in his expression broke then. Not dramatically, he simply looked at me differently. Maybe for the first time he saw the distance between who I was and the woman he had invented. What do you want? He asked. I thought about Charleston, the hospital coffee, the soup outside my door, Beacon, Vanessa, the prenup, the months of sitting across from him while both of us carried private versions of our marriage. I wanted a husband who knew me, I said. I don't think that's available anymore. He sat very still. We can fix this. Can we? We cancel the amendment discussion. We change the prenup if you want. We go to counseling. Vanessa leaves Astor House. I almost felt sorry for him then, because Ethan still thought the problem was a collection of terms that could be renegotiated. I don't want the prenup changed. Why? Because it does exactly what you wanted. He stared at me. Nora, you said you weren't risking your future on me. I agreed. That was before I understood. Exactly. I picked up my purse. You thought the terms were fair when you believed they protected only you. He stood. Where are you going? Rachel's. Tonight? Yes. Are you coming back? I looked around the kitchen, at the room where I had cooked for him, waited for him, read the plan for my own disappearance, and spent months trying to decide whether patience was strength or fear. Not tonight. I removed my wedding ring, not dramatically, just slowly, and placed it beside the 63-page disclosure. Ethan looked down at it. For once, he had nothing prepared to say. I walked out through the kitchen door and drove across Charlotte as the light disappeared behind me. At 8:14 the next morning, I sat across from Rachel Donnelly and signed the petition for divorce. Ethan had spent years preparing for the day he would leave me. He never once considered that I might leave first. The prenup did exactly what Ethan had designed it to do, and somehow that was the part he seemed least prepared to accept. 2 days after Rachel filed my divorce petition, Martin Hale asked for a private settlement conference at his office in Uptown Charlotte. I arrived with Rachel just before 9 on a cold Friday morning and found Ethan already sitting at the far end of a glass conference table, a legal pad in front of him, and a pen turning slowly between his fingers. I had watched that man negotiate hotel acquisitions worth tens of millions of dollars without touching a single object on the table. That morning, he couldn't stop moving his hands. He looked at me when I entered, then at my bare left hand. No ring. His eyes stayed there a second too long. Nora. Ethan. Nothing else. No hug, no private smile, no attempt to pretend we were still two people on the same side. Martin started with language about resolving matters efficiently, respectfully, and privacy. Privacy. I remember almost laughing at the word. Ethan had spent months preparing public language for my disappearance, but now that the truth had become inconvenient to him, privacy suddenly sounded noble. Rachel opened the prenup and began walking through it. Premarital assets remained separate. Appreciation tied to those assets remained separate. Income generated from them remained separate. Business interests purchased with traceable separate funds remained separate. Ethan's Astor House shares were his. Cedarvale was mine. His investment account stayed his. My grid path proceeds stayed mine. His protected real estate remained his. My private investments remained mine. Every clause Ethan had insisted on 12 days before our wedding now stood between him and the fortune he had never bothered to understand. After 20 minutes, Ethan interrupted. We know what it says. Rachel looked up. Then I'm not sure what part requires negotiation. His jaw tightened. The agreement was based on incomplete assumptions. No, Rachel said calmly. Your assumptions were incomplete. The disclosure was not. Martin stepped in before Ethan could answer. We are not alleging non-disclosure. Good, Rachel said, because your office acknowledged receipt of Nora's financial disclosure before execution. Ethan finally looked directly at me. You really expect me to believe this is what we intended? It's what you intended. I thought we were protecting what we each brought into the marriage. We are. That isn't what I mean. I know. I held his gaze. That's the problem. He leaned back. You know exactly what I'm saying. Yes, the agreement felt fair when you thought you had more to protect. Silence settled over the room. Martin looked down at his papers. Rachel didn't move. Ethan's expression hardened, but beneath the anger I saw something else now. Embarrassment. Not because he had underestimated my net worth. Because the prenup had turned his private assumption into a permanent record. He had written rules for a marriage in which he believed he was the powerful one, and now those same rules refused to recognize the hierarchy he had imagined. People often talk about fairness as though it is a principle they carry inside themselves. I had learned that sometimes fairness is only the name people give an arrangement while they believe they are winning. Change the direction of the benefit, and suddenly the principle needs revisiting. I'm not asking for your money, I said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Then what are you asking for? Exactly what the document says. And Cedarvale's Astor House stake? A separate investment purchased with separate funds through a properly managed vehicle. Rachel has already provided the records. You own part of my company? I own part of a company you happen to have run. That landed harder than I intended. Ethan had always spoken about Astor House as though the company and the man were interchangeable. My company, my properties, my board, my investors. Maybe that was part of why Beacon existed. If you start believing the business is an extension of yourself, eventually every person around it becomes an asset, a risk, or a narrative, even a wife. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody slammed a folder or walked out. Real divorces, especially expensive ones, are often painfully ordinary. Numbers get verified, titles get checked, lawyers speak in neutral voices while two people sit 6 feet apart, trying not to remember where they spent their first Christmas. Over the next several weeks, the settlement became exactly what the prenup had promised. Ethan kept what had been his, I kept what had been mine. The jointly purchased house was handled under the agreement and sold. Furniture was divided without a fight. I took my books, my mother's china, 2 paintings, and the old coffee grinder Ethan hated because it made too much noise. He took most of the wine collection and the ridiculous dining table he had insisted we needed for entertaining investors. I moved back into my townhouse in Myers Park. The first night there, I sat on the floor because most of my furniture was still in storage and ate Chinese takeout straight from the container. I expected to feel defeated. Instead, I noticed how quiet the room was. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference. Emptiness asks to be filled. Quiet lets you hear yourself again. The divorce itself might have ended there if Beacon had only been a private betrayal between a husband and wife. It wasn't. Astor House's recapitalization was still under formal review, and the same due diligence that exposed Cedar Vale's ownership also forced the company to examine communications connected to the investor narrative. Beacon was corporate material. The wedding timeline was corporate material. The executive stability strategy was corporate material, and once outside counsel saw it, no one could pretend the issue was simply that Ethan had been a bad husband. Susan Park's team began asking questions about governance, disclosure, and conflicts. Why had the CEO's marriage been incorporated into investor positioning documents? Why had the chief strategy officer participated in planning around the marriage while privately discussing a future with the CEO? Why had post-separation messaging been drafted before the transaction even closed? I never sent Beacon to the board. I never leaked emails. I never called a reporter. Rachel was clear from the beginning. We were not going to manufacture consequences. We would tell the truth where required and let institutions respond to what that truth meant. That distinction mattered to me. Revenge feels powerful because it gives pain a direction, but manufactured destruction still ties you to the person you are trying to escape. I wanted distance, not a new lifelong project called Ethan Weller. Vanessa was required to disclose the personal nature of her communications with Ethan. She maintained that their relationship had not become physical during the period covered by Beacon. Maybe that was true. By then, I no longer cared enough to investigate the difference. Emotional betrayal had already done the damage. More importantly for Astor House, Vanessa had helped shape an investor narrative around a CEO's marriage while privately discussing what would happen after that marriage ended. The board placed her on leave while the review continued. The recapitalization was postponed. Ethan was removed from direct control over the process pending the special committee's findings. One afternoon in July, he appeared at Rachel's office without Martin. I was there signing documents when the receptionist called back. Ethan is asking for 5 minutes. Rachel looked at me. You don't owe him 5 seconds. I know. I let him in anyway. He looked tired, not destroyed, not broken, just like a man who had gone too many weeks without being able to control the next sentence. The board thinks Beacon makes it look like I manipulated the marriage for investors, he said. I folded my hands. Did you? Not the way they're saying. How are they saying it? Like the wedding was fake. I looked at him for a long moment. I never said it was fake. He seemed almost surprised. You didn't? I think you loved me. I also think you used me. Both things can be true. He sat very still. Maybe that was the first time anyone had given him an explanation he couldn't negotiate with. Are you going public? He asked. No. His shoulders lowered. Thank you. Don't. He looked up. I'm not protecting you. I'm protecting the part of my life that comes after you. That was the last private conversation we had. Vanessa resigned from Astor House in early August and moved full-time into her real estate fund. Cedarvale kept its existing commitment because the underlying projects still made financial sense. I wasn't going to punish unrelated investors simply because I disliked the founder. By late August, the divorce settlement was final. Clean. No amendment to the prenup, no new claim against Cedarvale. I signed the last page in Rachel's conference room and felt something I had not felt in almost a year: stillness. 3 months later, in late November, Astor House announced that Ethan was stepping down as CEO as part of its leadership reset. I read the statement once on my phone while waiting for coffee and put the phone back in my bag. I thought that was the final consequence. I thought the story had finally reached the point where Ethan and Astor House would move in one direction and I would move in another. Then, that same week, my assistant appeared in my doorway just after lunch. "Nora, Thomas Whitaker is online too." "The chairman?" "Yes." "Did he say why?" She nodded. "He said he wants to talk about the future of Astor House." I looked at the blinking light on my phone and almost laughed at the symmetry of it. Ethan had spent our entire marriage believing Astor House needed protection from me. Now the company he once treated like an extension of himself was calling me because it needed something from the woman he had never bothered to understand. I let line 2 ring twice before I picked up. Not because I wanted Thomas Whitaker to wait. I just needed a second to appreciate the irony. For most of my marriage, Ethan had treated Astor House like a private country I could visit as long as I remembered I was a guest. I attended dinners, smiled for photographs, listened to hotel stories over breakfast, and stayed safely outside the rooms where decisions were made. Now the chairman of that same company was calling my office and asking to speak with me directly. Nora Beckett. "Nora, Thomas Whitaker." I knew his voice immediately. Thomas had chaired the Astor House board for almost 9 years. Former regional bank CEO, 64, soft-spoken in a way that made other people lower their voices without realizing it. I had met him at 3 company events while I was married to Ethan. He had always been polite to me, the kind of polished politeness powerful men use with spouses they assume are peripheral. "I know who you are," I said. "I thought you might." There was a small pause. "Do you have 15 minutes?" "I do." "Good. I'm going to try not to waste them." That made me sit back. Ethan would have begun with context. Thomas began with respect for time. "We've completed the first stage of the strategic review," he said. "Astor House is stable, but we have 2 serious problems: capital structure and credibility." I assumed both would be on the list. More specifically, leadership credibility. I looked through the glass wall of my office. Marcus was walking past with 2 analysts, arguing about some valuation model. Nobody outside my door knew that one of the most important conversations of my life was happening online too. That is how these moments usually arrive. No music, no perfect lighting, just a phone and a Tuesday afternoon. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Cedarvale stayed in the credit facility during the review." "Yes." "You had the ability to reduce exposure." "Yes, but you didn't." "The assets were still good." Thomas was quiet for a second. "That answer is why I called." I said nothing. "We're restructuring the recapitalization. Smaller transaction, less leverage, more patient equity. Cedarvale is one of the groups we want involved." "Then Marcus should be on this call." "For the investment, yes." "And the rest?" He paused. "We want you on the board." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was overwhelmed. I had considered the possibility after Ethan stepped down, but privately, imagining something is different from hearing it spoken aloud by the man who can actually make it happen. "Why?" I asked. Thomas gave a small laugh. "You want the flattering answer or the useful one?" "Useful." "You understand capital. You've built a company. You sold one successfully. Cedarvale behaved responsibly during a period when you had every personal reason not to. And you understand Astor House better than most outside investors because you've been close enough to see the company without confusing it with Ethan." That last sentence landed. Ethan had spent years treating himself and Astor House as interchangeable. His properties, his board, his investors, his future. But a company is rarely one person, no matter how much that person enjoys seeing his name reflected in it. It is thousands of people whose paychecks arrive whether the CEO is admired or despised. Housekeepers, chefs, front desk managers, engineers, accountants, people who never knew Beacon existed and had no reason to pay for it. "You're giving me credit for not damaging the company," I said. "I'm giving you credit for understanding that the company didn't betray you. Ethan did." I looked down at the desk. For months, I had thought of restraint as something I was doing to remain clean. Maybe Thomas saw it differently. Maybe restraint was not weakness or nobility. Maybe sometimes it was simply refusing to allow another person's behavior to decide what kind of person you became next. "Send me the board materials," I said. "I'll review them." "That's all I'm asking." The package arrived that afternoon, 78 pages. Property performance, debt maturities, renovation budgets, management turnover, expansion projections, a revised financing structure that was far less aggressive than Ethan's original plan. I read every page. Astor House had problems, but it was not dying. Charleston remained one of the strongest hotels in the portfolio. Savannah was recovering. Nashville had stabilized. Greenville needed disciplined capital, not panic. The company's greatest problem had not been bad properties. It had been leadership that confused confidence with immunity. I met Thomas and 3 directors the following Thursday in Charlotte. No Ethan, no Vanessa, no discussion of my marriage beyond what was legally unavoidable. They asked what I would cut. I told them. They asked where I would invest. I told them. They asked whether I thought Astor House should resume expansion within 12 months. No, I said. One director frowned. Why not? Because companies in recovery often mistake motion for proof that recovery worked. You don't need 3 new hotels. You need the 12 you already have to become boring again. Thomas smiled. Boring? Profitable, predictable, financeable. Boring is underrated when people are nervous. They kept asking, I kept answering. Near the end, Thomas folded his hands on the table. Would you take the seat? Not as currently structured. One director shifted, Thomas didn't. What would you change? Independent audit chair, stronger related party rules, no CEO participation in compensation oversight. If Cedarvale invests in the new financing, I recuse myself from votes where our interests conflict. Anything else? Yes. I looked around the table. Stop treating reputation management as governance. A polished story about leadership is not the same thing as trustworthy leadership. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Thomas nodded. Fair. We negotiated for another week. The final proposal was stronger than the first. I would become vice chair of a newly created investment and restructuring committee with authority over capital allocation, refinancing strategy, and property-level restructuring alongside independent directors. It was not ceremonial, which mattered to me. I had no interest in becoming the ex-wife they put in a press release because the symbolism looked good. If I was going to put my name beside Astor House, I wanted responsibility attached to it. I accepted. Marcus handled Cedarvale's investment discussions separately. Vanessa formally stepped away from the last of her Astor House advisory obligations and focused on her own real estate fund. Someone asked me whether Cedarvale intended to sell its position in her vehicle. Would we sell if somebody else had founded it? I asked. Marcus checked the numbers. No. Then we don't. That was the last decision I ever made, because Vanessa's name was attached to something. I never called her, never demanded an apology, never tried to make her fail. People imagine revenge requires intervention, but consequences often work better without help. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop standing between someone and the results of their own choices. Ethan texted me once during those weeks. I heard about the board offer. Congratulations. I read it and put the phone down. 20 minutes later, I answered, thank you. He replied, you'll be good for them. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted him wondering what I felt. I simply had a meeting in 10 minutes and work to finish. That fact stayed with me more than the message itself. 6 months earlier, a text from Ethan could have rearranged my entire evening. I would have studied every word, searched for regret, guilt, jealousy, some clue that he finally understood what he had lost. Now it was a text, nothing more. The revised financing closed in late spring. Less debt, longer maturities, a group of patient investors. Cedar Vale participated, but I remained outside any board vote where that participation created a conflict. Marcus brought barbecue into the office the afternoon the transaction closed. Someone bought a grocery store cake that said "Done" in crooked blue frosting. I liked that celebration more than the champagne dinners Ethan used to throw, because nobody in the room was performing success. They were simply relieved the work had finished. Astor House scheduled its new leadership announcement for the following Monday. My name would appear publicly beside Thomas Whitaker's and the new CEO's. Rachel called Sunday evening. "Big day tomorrow." "It's a press release." "You know what I mean." I did. Ethan would see it, Vanessa would see it, investors would see it. The same company whose internal documents once described me as a low-profile spouse and a positive stability signal would now identify me by my own record: founder of GridPath, principal of Cedar Vale Partners, vice chair of investment and restructuring. "How do you think you'll feel?" Rachel asked. I stood on the balcony of my townhouse and watched Charlotte settle into evening. "I don't know yet." That was the truth. I wasn't going to steal the answer from tomorrow just because I wanted this part of the story wrapped neatly. Monday morning at 7:30, the announcement went live. By 7:35, my phone started vibrating. Former employees, investors, friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored most of it, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. At 7:46, Rachel sent me the business article with one sentence beneath it. "Look at the headline." I opened the link. There was my name, Nora Beckett. Not Ethan Weller's wife, not his ex-wife, not a stability signal, just my name beside work I had earned the right to do. I read the headline once, locked my phone, and took a sip of coffee. I expected something bigger to happen inside me. Maybe satisfaction, maybe vindication, maybe the sharp pleasure of knowing Ethan would eventually see the same words. Instead, there was only a strange, unfamiliar calm. I wasn't ready to name it yet, but for the first time since I had opened Beacon, the next question in my life had nothing to do with what Ethan Weller thought. The Sunday after Astor House announced my new role, I woke up in Charleston instead of Charlotte. I had driven down the night before without telling anyone except Rachel, checked into a small inn 2 blocks from the water, and slept with the balcony door cracked open so I could hear the city before it fully woke. At 48, I had learned that peace rarely arrives with trumpets. Most of the time, it arrives as an ordinary morning where nobody needs anything from you. No board packet on the nightstand, no husband leaving before sunrise, no phone glowing with messages from a woman whose name you have trained yourself not to react to. Just coffee, soft light, and the strange realization that your nervous system has finally stopped expecting bad news. I walked to a cafe near King Street a little after 7. It wasn't fancy. The tables were too close together, the espresso machine was louder than necessary, and a college student behind the counter had written Nora B. on my cup, even though there was nobody else waiting. I liked it immediately. I took a seat by the window and opened my phone. The business article Rachel had sent the day before was still at the top of my messages. Astor House names Nora Beckett Vice Chair of Investment and Restructuring Committee. Beneath the headline was a photograph taken at the announcement. Me in a navy jacket, Thomas Whitaker beside me, the new CEO on the other side. I looked composed. People had always told me I looked calm in photographs. What photographs never showed was how much work calm sometimes required. I read the article once, then locked the screen. That was it. No screenshot sent to Ethan, no imaginary speech, no satisfaction at the thought of him opening the same headline. I had spent months assuming the ending would be the moment he finally understood who I was. Instead, the real ending arrived when I understood I no longer needed him to. That surprised me more than anything else. For so long, I had mistaken being underestimated for being unseen, and being unseen for being diminished. But someone else's poor vision does not reduce your size. It only limits what they are capable of recognizing. Ethan had looked at my old Volvo, my townhouse, my quiet schedule, my dislike of attention, and decided those things described the boundaries of my life. They didn't. They described my preferences. That distinction cost him more than money. It cost him the ability to know the woman sitting beside him. My phone buzzed. Rachel. I answered. You're awake early. I'm in Charleston. Of course you are. Why does that sound judgmental? Because normal people celebrate corporate appointments by drinking champagne. You apparently flee the state and order coffee. I smiled. I'm complicated. How does it feel? I looked through the window at a couple walking a golden retriever past the cafe. Quiet. Good quiet? I think so. She hesitated. Ethan called Thomas yesterday. I felt something small move in my chest, but it wasn't fear. About me? Not exactly. He congratulated the board on closing the financing. Thomas said Ethan was gracious. That's good. That's all you have? What do you want me to say? Rachel laughed. 6 months ago, you would have asked 17 questions. 6 months ago, I was still trying to solve him. I watched steam rise from my coffee. I don't think I am anymore. That sentence felt true as soon as I said it. There is a point after betrayal when understanding stops being healing and starts becoming another way of staying attached. Why did he do it? When did it start? Did he ever love me? Was Vanessa the cause or only the next chapter? I had asked those questions until they became furniture in my mind. Eventually, I realized none of the answers could return the version of my marriage I had believed in. Sometimes closure is not getting the final explanation. Sometimes closure is becoming tired of needing one. Rachel asked when I was coming home. Tomorrow. Board meeting Tuesday. I know. Try not to terrify them immediately. No promises. We hung up. I stayed at the cafe for another hour. At one point, an older woman at the table beside me recognized my name from the article on her tablet. Are you that Nora Beckett? She asked. I almost said no. Instead, I smiled. I am. She leaned closer. You're the one who came into Astor House after all that mess? I suppose. She shook her head slowly. Good for you. I thanked her, and that was the entire interaction. No one asked about Ethan. No one knew about Beacon. No one knew that my wedding had once been placed on a corporate timeline or that my marriage had been described as a stability signal. To her, I was simply a woman appointed to a board. I liked that version of the story, not because it erased what happened, but because it proved what happened was no longer the only thing that could define me. Later that morning, I walked toward the Battery, the same stretch of Charleston where Ethan had proposed years earlier. I hadn't planned to go there. My feet simply carried me. The sky was clear, the water bright enough to make me squint. I found the general area where he had stopped that Sunday morning and told me he didn't want to spend the next 20 years pretending he was still deciding what he wanted. For a moment, the memory came back so clearly, I could almost see him reaching into his coat pocket. I waited for anger. None came. Sadness, yes, but sadness is different after enough time. It stops demanding action. It just sits beside you for a while and reminds you that something mattered. I still believe the proposal had contained something real. Maybe not enough truth, maybe not enough courage, but something. I no longer needed to rewrite every good memory as manipulation in order to justify leaving. That would have given Ethan too much power too, turning the entire past into evidence against itself. A marriage can contain real love and still become unsafe. A person can mean some promises when they make them and still fail them later. The world is easier when we divide people into monsters and victims, but easier is not always truer. Ethan's greatest failure was not that he never cared about me. It was that he cared about his future more than he respected my right to have one of my own. Around noon, I got a text from him. I hadn't heard from him directly in almost 3 months. It said, I saw the announcement. Congratulations, Nora. You earned it. I stood near the water reading those 12 words. No apology, no request to talk, no manipulation I could detect, just a sentence I typed, thank you. Then I deleted it, typed, I hope you're well, deleted that too. Finally I sent, thank you, Ethan, nothing more. He reacted with a thumbs up 10 minutes later. That was our last exchange. People may expect me to say I wanted him miserable, that I felt I didn't. I wanted him away from the controls of my life. That was enough. I wanted Vanessa to fail for a while too, if I'm being truthful. But even that feeling faded. Cedar Vale's investment in her fund performed adequately. Not brilliantly, not disastrously. She built her business, I built mine. The universe did not rearrange itself into a morality play where everyone who hurt me lost everything. Real life usually refuses that kind of neatness. Consequences are rarely symmetrical. Ethan lost his CEO role but kept wealth, experience, friends, and a future. Vanessa lost her position at Astor House but kept her career. I lost a marriage, time I couldn't recover, and a version of trust I probably would never have again in exactly the same form. And still, I was okay. More than okay. That may have been the one outcome Ethan never planned for. Months later, Rachel asked me whether I regretted signing the prenup. I laughed. It was the most honest document in our marriage. She understood what I meant. Ethan had written terms designed to make sure I could never reach into his future. He had no idea those same terms would eventually prevent him from reaching into mine. The agreement didn't save me. Money didn't save me. Cedar Vale didn't save me. What saved me was the moment I stopped begging reality to be different and started making decisions based on what was actually in front of me. That sounds simple when I say it now. It wasn't. Acceptance can feel cruel when hope is still alive, but hope without evidence eventually becomes a place where you volunteer to stay hurt. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Walked away the night you found Beacon, confronted him immediately, or stayed quiet until you understood the whole truth? And if you've ever had someone underestimate you, tell me what happened. I think more people carry stories like this than we realize. By Monday morning, I was back in Charlotte. Tuesday, I sat at the Astor House board table for the first time. Nobody introduced me as Ethan Weller's former wife. Thomas introduced me as Nora Beckett, founder of GridPath, principal of Cedar Vale Partners, vice chair of investment and restructuring. Just my name, just my work, just my life. Before the meeting started, I opened the leather folder in front of me and found the revised capital plan inside. For a second, I remembered another folder years earlier, navy blue, pushed across a private dining table by a man who looked me in the eyes and said, "I'm not risking my future on you." I had smiled and told him to sign it. Back then, Ethan thought the smile meant I didn't understand what I was giving up. The truth was simpler. I already had a future before he entered my life. I just had to remember that it still belonged to me after he left it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Sometimes the person everyone thinks has the least power is simply the one who hasn't shown their hand yet.